Chapter 20, PowerPoint number 2. A man named Walter Lippmann, a historical writer, wrote Public Opinion and the Phantom Public. And in it, he expresses his belief that intelligence could not solve all the social problems in a great democracy, and that our American voters were ill-informed, irrational, and they did not look at the candidates or their politics. They were actually voting for the personality of the individual. And he truly believed that problems were beyond the understanding of the ordinary American. And the fact that of this independent citizen was a total myth. He also claimed that the government and the journalists and the advertisers were manipulating public opinion, which they had been all along. Robert and Helen Ludd, who wrote for the Middletown, they said leisure and consumption are replacing politics. And for the first time in decades, there's a decline in voting. As for government, well, government is very pro-business. It has been for some time. And lobbyists are tending to take the place of, instead of voting for somebody to do something for you in your district, you go to a lobbyist who goes to Washington and talks to people. And they're dominating the National Republican Party, and they're calling for the government to lower tax on individuals and businesses, personal property tax, etc., income tax. They wanted high tariffs, and they wanted to enforce an anti-union campaign. Presidents also appointed pro-businessmen to the Federal Reserve Board. And the government begins to issue injunctions to halt strikes. The Supreme Court becomes very conservative, and former President Taft becomes the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and returns us to laissez-faire type politics. He strikes down minimum wage law for women in D.C. Now this is our President Harding. This is a very brief bio, and it only covers really the historical view of him. And there's several different views of Mr. Harding, but we'll go into that a little bit later.
By 1920, Americans were tired of war abroad and progressive programs at home. The high-minded rhetoric of Woodrow Wilson had lost its appeal. The country was in a conservative mood. Number 29, Warren G. Harding, Republican, 1921 to 1923, 55 years old, from Ohio. Warren Harding is the only president to be elected on his birthday. In his successful campaign, he touted a return to normalcy.
We're not going to do anything big and ambitious. We're going to create a period in which things are quiet and calm.
A former newspaperman, Harding was the 7th president born in the state of Ohio. No one ever accused him of being a cold fish. He was an extrovert, a gambler, a drinker, and allegedly a womanizer. He also played the sousaphone.
He liked to be around people, liked to glad hand, liked to slap people in the back. That's actually a rather valuable political skill.
Harding has been portrayed as someone who wasn't fit to be president, that he lacked intellect and ambition.
People will say that he didn't want to be president or that he didn't have the self-confidence to do it. He did want to be president. He was a savvy man in his politics, and he did have a very strong sense for what he wanted to accomplish.
Harding wasn't the type of president who thought he had all the answers.
Mr. Harding said that he was inviting the best minds into the cabinet. In a very real sense, this was the case. His Secretary of State was Charles Evans Hughes, who was a distinguished man. His Secretary of Commerce was Herbert Hoover. This was a good cabinet.
Harding's most important achievement was the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921. Passed at Harding's urging, it gave the executive branch greater control over federal spending, and for the first time in history, required the president to submit an annual budget to Congress. Harding scored the other great success of his presidency when he convened an international conference in Washington that resulted in an historic arms reduction agreement between the naval powers of the world.
The Washington Naval Conference was the only serious arms limitation arrangement that was made in the 20s and 30s. That was Mr. Harding.
In the summer of 1923, Harding took a train trip west, becoming the first sitting president to visit Alaska. But his health was failing. On July 29th, he arrived at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco and checked into the presidential suite to recuperate. 4 days later, with his wife Florence at his bedside, the president suffered a heart attack. Florence pleaded with the doctors to save him, but it was too late. Harding was dead.
Those people who have any image of Harding at all remember him as a kind of joke, and certainly as a failure. It would be hard for such people to understand the enormity of the response to Harding's death.
It would be a short-lived period of grief and reverence. Less than a year after his death, several scandals came to light that forever shattered Harding's image. The most significant scandal involved Harding's Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall. He was accused of improperly leasing Navy oil reserves at Elk Hills, California, and Teapot Dome in Wyoming to a pair of wealthy oil men in exchange for an illegal kickback. Teapot Dome, as the affair came to be known, was the most infamous presidential scandal prior to Watergate.
I don't know of any evidence that Harding actually was complicit in these scandals or that he personally benefited from them, but he certainly was guilty of appointing mediocre, not very honest people to very significant positions.
Harding's reputation was further tarnished by the publishing of two scandalous books. One insinuated that the president's wife, Florence, had poisoned him. Another was written by Nan Britton, a woman who claimed to have had an affair with Harding and given birth to his daughter. These sensational tales were dubious at best, but widely believed at the time. Today, Harding is remembered more for the scandals that swirled around him, both real and imagined, than anything else. One historian who has re-examined Harding's record thinks history has been particularly unfair to our 29th president.
He was a good president, even verging on an excellent president. His great tragedy was that physically he was unable to live out his term. He was good with the Senate. He was good on foreign affairs. He was good with the budget. And I ask, what more do you wish?
The excuse me, claim that his wife had poisoned him would be disproven at the end of the 20th century. Also, the fact that this alleged affair was proven to be true because with DNA tests they proved that he did have a daughter. But there again, it seemed like most men in power have a very healthy libido. President Calvin Coolidge, remember him? He was the governor who broke the policeman strike. He'd been Harding's vice president, so when Harding died, he became president. But he is very uncharismatic. He reminds me a bit of Wilson in that straight-laced look on his face. Very pro-business, a very ultra-conservative. He favored tax cuts and limited government spending. He ran for and won re-election, and re-election, he was elected first as vice president. First time he ran for president. He was, in 1924, he was known as an honest Yankee. And for us Southerners, I guess that's kind of an oxymoron. I'm introducing you to some people who were very prominent during this decade. Robert LaFollette, former governor of Wisconsin. He was a senator for Wisconsin. He ran against Coolidge in 1924 from the Progressive Party for president. His platform was higher taxes on the wealthy. Gee, that sounds like something we hear today. He wanted public ownership of the railroads. He wanted relief for the farmers. And he wanted a ban on child labor of any kind. Jane Addams and the AFL endorsed, but unfortunately the only state he carried was Wisconsin. Coolidge described Lafayette's platform as a communist and socialistic idea. Now, foreign affairs also reflected the alliance between business and government. And this decade saw a retreat from Wilsonian internationalism toward unilateral American actions mostly intended to boost our exports and investment opportunities abroad. This was called what we call isolationism, and was a reaction against disappointments over Wilson's aggressive military and diplomatic stance. The U.S. hosted the Washington Naval Arms Conference, which was mentioned in the little video, and secured smaller navies for Britain, France, Japan, Italy, and the United States. But our country stayed outside the League of Nations, and American tariffs were raised to their highest levels in history, repudiating Wilson's commitment to free trade. Foreign policy was largely developed to private economic relationships rather than government activity. The United States emerged from World War I as the world's major manufacturing and financial power. In New York in the 1920s, bankers, sometimes acting alone and sometimes with help from the Harding and Coolidge administrations, made huge loans to Europe and Latin American governments. American industrial firms, especially in auto, agricultural machinery, and electric equipment manufacturing, began to establish overseas plans to supply the world market and find cheaper labor. Sound familiar? American investors gained control over raw materials such as copper in Chile, oil in Venezuela, and when American economic interests seemed threatened, the government sent in the troops, invading once more the Nicaraguans to suppress a nationalist revolt. Anytime we felt our businesses were threatened, we were justified in intervening. Now, wartime and post-war repression, prohibition, and pro-business politics in wartime in the 1920s damaged the progressives' belief that the federal government could represent national purposes and enhance freedom. Progressives gained a new appreciation of civil liberties, rights that an individual may assert, even against democratic majorities, as fundamental features of American freedom. Reformers now encouraged open and democratic debate, and in the 1920s, and a coherent concept of civil liberties and legal protections for freedom of speech against the government begins to emerge. But we've got repressions, big time. Wartime and post-war repression persisted in the 20s. Lynchings, of course, continued, and people endorsing free speech or radical doctrines were arrested and attacked by authorities and private citizens. Government agencies such as the Postal and Customs Services began to censor books considered obscene. A Watch and Ward committee in Boston excluded dozens of books from bookstores, including works by the novelist Upton Sinclair, Theodore Dreiser, and even Ernest Hemingway. Movie producers feared that scandals involving actors might reinforce beliefs that the movies promoted immorality. In 1922, the film industry adopted something called the Hays Code, which barred movies from depicting nudity, adultery, and long kisses. Also, you couldn't have two people in the same bed. Only in 1951 would the Supreme Court offer First Amendment protections for films. Now here we see a picture of the can-can, and the more and more Europeans consumed American popular culture, some began to see America as culturally vapid. In other words, we ain't got no culture, folks. The British novelist D.H. Lawrence, who lived briefly in the U.S., said that America might take pride in being the land of the free, but the free mob had destroyed the right to dissent. And American artists, dissatisfied with American conservatism and materialism, and of course they wanted to drink legally, began to migrate to Paris. And of course, an awful lot of your African American performers did also. The concern for civil liberties grew from the arrests of the anti-war dissenters under the Espionage and Sedition Acts, and it began to inspire the formation of a group that 3 years later would become the American Civil Liberties Union. And for the rest of the 20th century, the ACLU would take on many of the important legal cases that established the rights revolution in America. They also helped to inject meaning into traditional liberties such as freedom of speech, and invented new rights such as the right to privacy. But the ACLU began as a coalition of pacifists, progressives, and lawyers outraged by the violation of Americans' rights by the government during the war. Now, before the war, the Supreme Court had done little to protect the rights of unpopular minorities. And initially, the court held itself restricted its civil liberties. In 1919, the court upheld the constitutionality of the Espionage Act and the conviction of Charles T. Schnupp, a socialist, who sent anti-graft leaflets to the mails. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes spoke for the court when he declared that the First Amendment did not prevent the Congress from prohibiting free speech that presented a clear and present danger or inspiring illegal activity. Free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. And this became the basis of the Supreme Court decisions and future Supreme Court cases. But since it allowed public officials to determine what kind of speech was dangerous, it kind of proved an arbitrary doctrine. Because unfortunately now public officials determine what is dangerous. And the problem comes in, you might have someone who's good at this now, but when he leaves, somebody else comes in. And in the end, the court by 1919, the court also upheld the convictions of Jacob Abram and 5 other men for passing out pamphlets criticizing America's military intervention in Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution. When a minority dissented, forming the basis for the future defense of free speech is necessary in the great marketplace of ideas. By the end of the 1920s, the court had invalidated state laws making it illegal to advocate unlawful acts or changes in the political economic system. But meanwhile, we've got things going on in our society, like notoriety. And it's noticed that even though we have an increase in the sale of newspapers, we have a decrease in the sale of regular newspapers. We're starting to see more of the little pamphlets like, Star, National Enquirer, things. And they discovered that sensationalism is selling newspapers. And if, for instance, a murder trial in Chicago got more play than a presidential election because people were more interested in what was going on. So I'm going to tell you a little story now. And in this area, you never have heard of it, about a man named Floyd Collins. Now, he was exploring for underground passages to make money in southwestern Kentucky, down around where they've got the Mammoth Cave. And this is loaded with caves in that area. And he was trying to find a cave that he could open up to the public to make some money. And he crawled into this little cave and he got pinned under a rock, fell on his foot. The passage was steep and narrow and he couldn't escape. But he had 3 friends who were with him and they were outside trying to figure out how to get him out. Meanwhile, a man named W.B. Miller, who was a newspaper man out of Louisville on vacation, he sees these guys standing around a hole in the ground and he stopped to see what was going on. Well, he thought this was a good human interest story, so he wrote it up and he sent it back to his editor. And to his surprise, he discovered that the editor had gone on the wire, and the entire country started watching it. Page 1 above the fold. Now, unless you're familiar with newspaper talk, you don't know. When you buy a newspaper, folks, and they still do print them, it's folded. And when you first see it, you see that first page, and you see above the fold. Above the fold, the New York Times was the place you wanted to be, and Floyd Collins was dead in a cave, trapped on his 18th day. They had grown from a party of 3 men to hundreds. They brought in the National Guard, and they fenced off the area. Why? Because the country was interested in what was going to happen? Was he going to live or was he going to die? Who is this little unknown man? And it was really exciting, but once he died, of course, nobody else cared. And the very next month in North Carolina, 71 men were trapped in a cave in and 53 died. But there was no excitement, no struggle, no interest because there was a cave in and they died. You didn't have the anticipation. You didn't have the mystery. So sensationalism is working. And we've got these fads going all over. And some of you probably heard of it. Something as simple as crossword puzzle and mahjong and contract bridge became very, very popular. Golf for the upper class, tennis for the upper class. And for us lowly little common people, bowling, marathons, walking, and dancing marathons. You've probably seen movies about they dance for 3 or 4 days. You got Pulp Fiction writing. Agatha Christie's writing right now. She's a very, very popular author. And we're starting to have what we call, I guess, cultural conflicts. Now, folks, I'm not giving you any information that's not in your text. I'm just not giving it to you in the order it's in your text, or I'm giving you different slant on some of it. So we basically had 4 real big big cultural conflicts. It was gender, immigration, prohibition, and evolution. And each one resulted from new ways of the common man's life. And I'm going to give you a little bit of information on what each one of these cultural conflicts involved. Gender. It was a women's movement. It had already split the ERA, and it was part of the reasoning was used to defeat the ERA was that you would remove all protections for women in the workforce, and women would be drafted just like men, and women would be forced to have one bathroom, unisex bathroom, where everybody used the same bathroom. And it just didn't seem right to a lot of women, and men too, so it was split. And of course, they got all these new sexual freedoms, which we get into the flapper very shortly. Prohibition. Now, class, national origin, and religion were all factors. The Catholics, of course, were against it. The immigrants were for it. Your very devout Baptists were against it. It's like I say, depending on what part of the country you were in. And I know in our state of Kentucky, which is the home of bourbon, we have some counties that are dry and have some counties where you can buy it at the gas station. It just depends on where you're from and the religion that's in that area. But by prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and distribution, you're not going to get the Americans to stop drinking, no matter what you do. It's not going to happen. You're just going to drive it underground and produce a new class of businessmen called bootleggers and criminals. And of course, in immigration, we're terrified of all these immigrants coming in from Southern Europe. Nativism. If you're not 100% native-born American, you just don't count. In evolution, we're beginning to complain that religion's going out of style, and it's just terrible. I mean, they have two different types. You have the conservatives and you have the fundamentalists in religion. You've got this invasion of new scientific ideas every day. And it's hard for us to believe that we're on a very insignificant satellite. We always thought we were the center of the universe, and we find out we're not. And then we learn that our behavior depends on our chromosomes. And psychology becomes king. It holds the key to all the problems, from being bald to having sexual hang-ups. And the churches are worrying over this. And God's going out of our lives. And the Protestant churches are beginning to split into what we call the modernists and the fundamentalists. And the modernists are trying to reconcile all these new ideas with their religion. The fundamentalists are disregarding all the new ideas and refer to the letter of the Bible. If it's not in the Bible, it ain't going to count. Like I said, the fundamentalist position is the letter of the Bible. And in instructing some of their state legislatures, especially in the South of the Bible Belt, to forbid the teaching of evolution. Now, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Oklahoma, those states were successful in getting it passed. Now, Billy Sunday had been a professional baseball player, and he became a revivalist preacher and became the most well-known and was speaking on the radio about this time. So, enter John Scopes. John Scopes was a local biology teacher. I'm trying to find where I've got it written about it. I got a lot written down about him. I got him here somewhere. I'll just have to tell you what I remember. He was a young man. Now, you've got to stop and think a minute. In the 1920s, we didn't have television, and we had very little radio. The movies were still silent. And in the summertime, when nothing was going on, school wasn't going on, what did students do? Yeah, I can really remember it in my little town, very small town, population 15,000. In the summertime, the key to excitement was to go to a movie on Saturday. If you couldn't do that, you go down to the local drugstore. At the local drugstore, they had this long counter where they served you ice cream and sodas and sandwiches. And also on the other side of the store, they had this big old long rack of magazines and funny books and newspapers and things. And in the back, they had the pharmacy. And up there around the drugstore, I mean, not the drugstore, but up around the part where they sold the sodas and stuff, they had little, what we call Coke tables, those little bitty round tables with the metal chairs. And you'd sit there and you'd drink your Coke. And if you were hoping the pharmacist wasn't looking, you'd sneak off and get you a magazine and bring it over and read it. And it just drove the pharmacist crazy because you're reading the magazines and not buying them. But anyway, John Scopes and a couple of his friends were down at the local, I guess you'd say local drugstore, and they were having their lemonade. And they got to talking about this new law in Tennessee where you couldn't teach the theory of evolution. So they said, John, you know, you're a biology teacher. What do you do? He said, well, I don't teach it. And they said, what we need to do is stir things up around here. I mean, get a little excitement going. When you go back to school this semester, why don't you teach it and see what happens? Well, what's the worst they can do? Firing. So he said, okay. So when schools came, he broke the law. He taught evolution, and when he was caught, he was arrested, arrested, and put on trial. Now, of course, the ACLU arranged for Clarence Darrow to defend him, one of the most famous defenders of the time, and William Jennings Bryan volunteered to be the prosecutor. The trial was set for July of 1925. Now, it has been suggested and hinted at, but never proven 100%, that the ACLU contacted Scopes and asked him to teach evolution, to have a test case to see if they could, get rid of this law on the Tennessee books. It was a very strange trial. Dayton, Tennessee was a little farming community. And the farmers and family would go into town with their horse-drawn wagons to see what all this is about. Revivalists are showing up, and they're holding meetings on the street corners, and you've got hot dog vendors, and you've got Bible vendors, and it's just like a carnival atmosphere. You got 100 newsmen. They took over the back room of one of the local grocery stores and set up their telephone lines so they could talk to their newspapers. And the courtroom was filled with reporters and cameras. Very few actual people could get in there because there were so many reporters. And the evidence against him was one of the students that was taught by Scopes. They said, yes, he'd been taught evolution, and the student said it didn't hurt him any. The zoologist testified that life began 600 million years ago. And all while this is all going on, news is being telegraphed to England and Switzerland and Italy and Germany, Russia, China, and Japan. And the irony is, this trial is so strange. On the first day of the trial, the major news wasn't what was going on so much as the judge's daughters. They showed up in court with their stockings rolled down and showed their bare legs. Oh my goodness. And this made headlines. The Attorney General for Tennessee shouts that the doctrine is robbing the Tennessee children of a chance of eternal life. Attorney Bryant charged Darrow with only wanting to slur the Bible. You're not here to prove anything except slur the Bible. This is a picture of both. Now, William Jennings Brown, he looks like a preacher. Clarence Darrow, he almost looks like a gangster, doesn't he? But they were both excellent lawyers. But Mr. Bryant was a very devout fundamentalist. Now, on the day that Bryant was going to put Darrow on the stand, it was a very hot day, so they held court outside. They built a little platform and put the judge's chair up Darrow on top so people could see when they were under a tree. And Bryant asked Darrow to defend the Bible. He was asking him, did he believe the story about Jonah and the whale? Yeah. Did you believe the story about Tower of Babel? Yeah. And goes on. He said, okay. Where did Adam and Eve's children get their wives? If they were the only two in the Garden of Eden, where did they get their wives? And he couldn't justify it. He said he didn't know. Well, he couldn't clarify, and the judge threw all the testimony of the Bryant side out. They couldn't get any of the scientific evidence in, and the judge found Scopes guilty and fined him $100. Well, this is what they really wanted. They wanted to be found guilty, so they take the court to the Tennessee Supreme Court, hoping it was going to be upheld, and once it's upheld as him being guilty, they could take it to the United States Supreme Court and hopefully get this Tennessee law judged as unconstitutional. But the Tennessee Supreme Court surprised everybody by reversing the ruling, saying the $100 fine was unconstitutional. That it was on the books, the fine for something like that was only $50. Therefore, the judge had violated the law and they reversed the ruling. So, in effect, you couldn't take it to the Supreme Court, and never did get to the Supreme Court. It's still on the law. I know in Oklahoma, I lived out there a couple of years, and I know there was a lot of problems because if you graduated from a university in Oklahoma and wanted to go on further, you had never had any scientific teachings about the opposite theory of evolution versus creationism. And it was going to cause some problems. And nativism. They got a new National Origins Act in 1924, which we talked about earlier, where they based the amount of people that could come in on your country of origin, and they went back far enough that they based it on populations at a certain time in history when there was very few here from Southern Europe, because they wanted the Northern Europeans to come in. They just didn't want the Southern Europeans to come in. And so during this time, you also see the growth of the KKK. Sad, sad, sad. It resurged in 1915 during the war under Colonel William Sims. And they were against everything. These were not redneck Southerners. These were blue-collar workers from the Midwest. And they weren't just against blacks. They were against blacks and Jews and Catholics and anybody who was not 150% red, white, and blue. And like I said, it wasn't in the South. It was predominantly in the Midwest. People you'd never suspect. And I did not know till after my grandfather died that he also was a member of the KKK, although he was from Kentucky. It's just a picture that reminds you. And of course, there's other conflicts. The United Negro Improvement Association, started by Marcus Garvey. You've got the Harlem Renaissance. You've got the Sexual Revolution. You've got the fear of white slavery, which is a joke. Somehow or another, they got worried about sweetness and women going to the big cities and being kidnapped by bad men, forced to stay in a room and fed drugs until they become a drug addict. And once they became a drug addict, you could force them to become a prostitute. That's what you call white slavery. You got more people living in the cities and on the farms. And the African-American migration is still going on. And you got local codes being passed all the time to restrict where they can live and work and go to school. But everything in the 20s isn't all bad. You've got some wonderful things being written. You've got Ernest Hemingway and Eugene O'Neill. You've got Zane Grey and his wonderful westerns. You've got Edgar Rice Burroughs and Tarzan. They're being written. You've got good music. Aaron Copland, Charles Ives, and of course George Gershwin. All that beautiful music coming out of the 20s. But you got politics and problems. As I said, W.G. Harding was elected in 1922, and of course his era of politics, his tenure in the office is going to be noted for corruption. You got Coolidge, the vice president, was elected to fill a full term. He wasn't a very good president. And you got J. Edgar Hoover, elected in 1928, Idaho, spokesman for the future. He gets the blame a lot for the depression, the stock market crash, but the things that were going on in the 1920s were going on long before he took over. And he didn't really have his finger on the pulse of the country. He just seemed to be out of place. It kind of reminds me of when the first Bush went grocery shopping. He didn't know about the scanners. He didn't know about, he'd never gone grocery shopping. He didn't know how the normal people lived. Now, that don't make him bad. It just makes him out of touch. And he thought when the Depression hit that it was just a temporary hiccup in the economy. It'll pass. Enter Black Tuesday, October the 29th, 1929. In 5 hours, we lost $10 billion in value. A panic ensued, and market value just disappeared. And the United States quickly found itself in the Great Depression, the greatest economic calamity in modern history. Now, signals of the impending disaster were visible before that. In Southern California and Florida, they had experienced spectacular real estate booms and busts, which resulted in failed banks and foreclosed mortgages. The highly unequal distribution of the income and persistent depression in farming areas reduced America's purchasing power. Sales of new autos and household goods had stagnated. I mean, how many cars can you have and how many refrigerators do you need? Stocks momentarily rebounded because some of the big spenders got together and bought stock at above what it was selling for. But around 26,000 businesses had failed, and those that survived cut back on employment and investment. The gold standard-based financial system was not effectively meeting the downturn. Germany began to default in its repaying of its debts. Banks failed throughout the world as depositors began to withdraw money. Billions of people lost their savings. Like I said, stocks had momentarily rebounded, but it didn't last. And by 1932, the economy hit rock bottom, with then something like 11 million workers, 25% of our labor force, unemployed. Those who had jobs faced reduced wages and hours, and every industrial economy in the world suffered, but the United States was hit the hardest and lasted the longest. The Depression quickly transformed American lives as hundreds of thousands took to the road to look for work. Some stood in bread lines and erected shacks called Hoovervilles, and cities exhausted their poor relief. The Depression actually reversed the long-standing migration of Americans from farms to cities as people tried to find land to grow food on for their family. The suicide rate rose to the highest level in American history, and the birth rate dropped to its lowest. Of course, many Americans, well, they say our image was damaged. Big business in Wall Street, oh man, we didn't like them at all. They were shown to have thrived on the shady dealings and the sale of worthless bonds. And a lot of Americans responded to the Depression with resignation, or they blamed themselves for their economic woes. Others responded with protests that were at first spontaneous and lacking coordination, because the unions and the socialist group and others that might have led them had been devastated in the early 20s. In early 1932, 20,000 unemployed World War I veterans marched in Washington, D.C. to demand early payment of a bonus that was not supposed to be paid until 1945. They built cities of tents on the White House lawn. And it looked bad because it was covered with a new thing called these moving pictures that were taken pictures of and shown in the theater. They had radios and pictures in the newspaper. And the president made a very bad decision. He says, we can't have this, it's bad. So he sent out the troops and dispersed them. And there were troops killed. I mean, there were not troops killed, but there were protesters killed, and the tents were burned. And it all was shown on the newspapers. But throughout the country, demonstrations of the unemployed demanded work and relief. Farmers were protesting low prices by temporarily blocking the road to prevent goods from going to market. And the small Communist Party was the only group that seemed able to channel and direct the discontent. Communists formed unemployment councils that organized marches and demonstrated for public assistance and opposed evictions of unemployed families. And the newspapers worried that, was America close to another revolution? And to many Americans, Hoover's response to the Depression seemed totally inadequate and lacking in compassion. His advisors told him that the Depression was a normal function of capitalism, and it's just a temporary bust. And as any speeches that the president gave, we call them jawboning. He seemed like I said, he was totally ignorant of the problems facing the ordinary Americans. And most people did not believe that even if you got federal assistance to the unemployed, it's not going to spur any recovery. He raised the tariffs, supposedly to protect our businesses here at home. But what happens? The other countries retaliated, and they raised their tariffs, so we couldn't import them either. And so at the end, all it did was reduce foreign trade. He taxed the citizens to balance the budget, and you have less money, it reduces consumer purchasing power. But did he do anything good? Yeah, he did have some accomplishments. He did recreate the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and he did give money to some failing banks and the railroad. He did veto bills to create employment. He approved a $2 billion bill to aid unemployment, and no more, because any more would be a disservice to the jobless. And like I say, some people over in America have accepted the limits of free speech and suppression of civil liberties. So the 1920s prosperity that had encouraged laissez-faire, now Depression and Hoover's failed responses discredited the good of a decade. Now I've got 11 things listed here that were warning signs that they were there, we just didn't see them. And like I said at the beginning, 40% of the families live below the poverty level. Wages are falling because prosperity is bypassing a lot of groups, the immigrants, the Hispanics, the African Americans. Farm prices are depressed because after the war, we didn't have the need for all the growing things that they've been growing and gotten wealthy on. And once their money stops coming in, they stop buying. And once they stop buying and don't have any money come in, they default on their debts. And at this point in time in history, the banks depended upon the amount of money they had in the banks to do anything. So when the farmers stop paying their debts, the banks fail. And when the banks fail, it takes everybody down with you. Because even if you've got a good business that's doing good and you've got money in the bank, when the bank closes its doors, you lose your money. So with the larger business failing, the banks failing and closing, the small businesses fail because you got their money. And we consumers had humongous debts because they'd been encouraged to buy on credit. And of course, with less money around, business investment declined. Construction of new homes was off. It had been off for some time. And like I said, we got excessive inventories because how many cars and refrigerators do you need? So the first thing that's going to happen when my warehouse fills up with manufactured goods, I'm going to start laying people off. And the Federal Reserve slowed down the money supply. And the government raised the tariff rates, which really cut back totally on foreign trade. So did all this cause a depression? And could it have been avoided? Could it happen again? Now, if you had been president about that time, how would you have handled it? Now, those are 4 questions I want you to think about a little bit. There's called think questions. You don't have to answer them, but just stir up the gray cells and think about it. Now, I've got a little video here from Mr. Green that kind of sums it all up. It's a short one. It's like 12 and a half minutes, so please do watch it. I don't even think we've got a commercial this time. I think we'll go right into it.
Hey guys, it's Annie. Now, if you're anything like me, you're always looking for ways to save money, especially when it comes to your week.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to learn about one of the best eras ever, the 1920s. The 20s gave us jazz, movies, radio, making out in cars, illegal liquor, and the 20s also gave us prosperity, although not for everybody, and gangsters, and a consumer culture based on credit, and lots of prejudice against immigrants, and eventually the worst economic crisis the U.S. has ever seen. Mr. Green, but what about Gatsby? Yeah, me from the past, it's true that Gatsby turned out all right in the end, but what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust trailed in the wake of his dreams, did temporarily close out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. So there's a stereotypical view of the 1920s as the Roaring 20s, a decade of exciting change and new cultural touchstones, as well as increased personal freedom and dancing. And it really was a time of increased wealth for some people. The quote of the decade has to go to our famously taciturn president from Massachusetts, Calvin Coolidge, who said, "The chief business of the American people is business. Jay-Z would later update this for the 21st century, noting, "I'm not a businessman, I'm a businessman." But anyway, during the 1920s, the government helped business grow like gangbusters, largely by not regulating it much at all. This is known as laissez-faire capitalism, or laissez-faire capitalism if you're good at speaking French. The Republican Party dominated politics in the 1920s, with all the presidents elected in the decade being staunch conservative Republicans. The federal government hewed to the policies favored by business lobbyists, including lower taxes on personal income and business profits, and efforts to weaken the power of unions. Presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover stocked the boards of the Federal Reserve and the Federal Trade Commission with men who shared their pro-business views, shifting the country away from the economic regulation that had been favored by progressives. And that was very good for the American economy, at least in the short run. The 1920s were also marked by quite a bit of government corruption, most of which can be pinned to the administration of Warren G. Harding. Now, Harding himself wasn't terribly corrupt, but he picked terrible friends. They included Attorney General Harry Doherty, who accepted money to not prosecute criminals, and Interior Secretary Albert Fall, who took $500,000 from private business in exchange for leases to government oil reserves at Teapot Dome. Fall later became the first cabinet member ever to be convicted of a felony. But on the other hand, business, man! Productivity rose dramatically, largely because older industries adopted Henry Ford's assembly line techniques, and newer industries like aviation, chemicals, and electronics grew up to provide Americans with new products and new jobs. During the 1920s, annual production of cars tripled to 4.8 million, and automobile companies were gradually consolidated into the big three that we know today: Ford, Chrysler, and Harley-Davidson. What? General Motors. By 1929, half of all American families owned a car, and thus began the American love affair with the automobile, which is also where love affairs were often consummated, which is why in the 1920s cars came to be known as scootily-pooping chariots. What's that? They were called brothels on wheels. And the economy also grew because American corporations were extending their reach overseas, and American foreign investment was greater than that of any other country. The dollar replaced the pound as the most important currency for trade, and by the end of the decade, America was producing 85% of the world's cars and 40% of its overall manufactured goods. Stan, can I get a libertage? And companies churned out all kinds of labor-saving devices like vacuum cleaners, toasters, refrigerators, and not having to spend all day washing your clothes or turning over your own toast like some kind of commoner meant that Americans had more time for leisure. And this was provided by radios and baseball games, boxing matches, vacations, dance crazes. I mean, before Gangnam Style, there was the Lindy and the Charleston. But probably the most significant leisure product was movies, and I'm not just saying that because I'm staring into a camera. The American film industry moved out to Hollywood before World War I because land was cheap and plentiful. All that sunshine meant that you could shoot outside all year round, and it was close to everything: desert, mountains, ocean, plastic surgeons. And by 1925, the American film industry had eclipsed all of its competitors and become the greatest in the world, especially if you count by volume and not quality. And more people had money to go see those movies thanks to consumer debt. The widespread use of credit and layaway buying plans meant that it was acceptable to go into debt to maintain what came to be seen as the American standard of living, and this was a huge change in attitude. These days we don't even think of credit cards as debt, really, but they are. And that was a relatively new idea, as was another feature of American life in the 20s that is still with us: celebrity. Opera singer Enrico Caruso has often been called the first modern celebrity, but now he's a lot less famous than Charlie Chaplin or Rudolph Valentino or Babe Ruth. But probably the biggest celebrity of the decade was Charles Lindbergh, whose claim to fame was flying across the Atlantic Ocean by himself without stopping, although he did use an airplane, which makes it slightly less impressive. Now, Lindbergh wasn't a truly contemporary celebrity in the sense of being famous for being famous, but he was a business more than a businessman. High culture also flourished. This was the age of the lost generation of American writers, many of whom lived and worked in Europe, but America had its own version of Paris in New York. The decade of the 1920s saw continued migration of African American people from the South to cities in the North, and Harlem became the capital of Black America. And speaking of migration, let us now migrate to the chair for the mystery document. The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document, I'm either right or I get shocked with the shock pen. All right, let's see what we got here. If we must die, let it not be like hogs hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. Like men will face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fight back. Stan, thank you for the poetry. I appreciate that. It's not some obscure document from 18th century blah, blah, blah. It's Claude McKay, Harlem Renaissance poet. The poem is called If We Must Die. Oh, it's the only thing in the world I'm actually good at. Now, I know this from the imagery alone, especially the line about mad and hungry dogs that would figuratively and literally make up the mobs at the lynchings. But the giveaway here is the ultimate sentiment that we will fight back. This was part of the spirit of the Harlem Renaissance, which rejected stereotypes and prejudice and sought to celebrate African-American experience. Meanwhile, things were changing for women as well, as they found new ways to express autonomy. Flappers kept their hair and skirts short, smoked and drank illegally in public, and availed themselves of birth control. And marketers encouraged them to buy products like cigarettes, christened Torches of Freedom by Edward Bernays. Liberation had its limits, though. Most women were still expected to marry, have children, and find their freedom at home through the use of washing machines. But the picture of prosperity is, as usual, more complicated than it at first appears. The fact that so many Americans were going into debt in order to pursue the American dream meant that if the economy faltered, and it did, there was going to be lots of trouble. Let's go to the thought bubble. Prosperity in the 1920s wasn't equally distributed through the population. Real industrial wages rose by a quarter between 1922 and 1929, but corporate profits rose at twice that rate. By 1929, 1% of the nation's banks controlled 50% of the nation's financial resources, and the wealthiest 5% of Americans' share of national income exceeded that of the bottom 60%. An estimated 40% of Americans lived in poverty. Now, many Americans celebrated big business, and Wall Street was often seen as heroic, possibly because by 1920, about 1.5 million Americans owned some kind of stock. But big business also meant that smaller businesses disappeared. During the 1920s, the number of manufacturing workers declined by 5%, the first time this class of workers had seen its numbers drop, but not the last. Now, some of these jobs were made up for by new jobs in retail, finance, and education, but as early as the 1920s, New England was beginning to see unemployment and deindustrialization as textile companies moved their operations to the South, where labor was cheaper. And working class people still made up the majority of Americans, and they often couldn't afford these newfangled devices. Like in 1930, 75% of American homes didn't have a washing machine, and only 40% of them had a radio. Farmers were even worse off. Many had prospered during World War I when the government subsidized farm prices in order to keep farms producing for the war effort, but when the subsidies ended, production didn't subside, largely due to mechanization and increased use of fertilizer. Farmers' incomes dropped steadily, and many saw banks foreclose upon their property. For the first time in American history, the number of farms declined during the 1920s. For farmers, the Great Depression began early. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So in general, the federal government did little to nothing to help farmers or workers. The Supreme Court was the only segment of the government that kept any progressive ideas alive as they began to craft a system of ideas that we call the jurisprudence of civil liberties. Now, the court still voted to uphold convictions of left-wing critics of the government, but gradually began to embrace the idea that people had the right to express dissonant views in what Oliver Wendell Holmes called the marketplace of ideas. In Narr versus Minnesota, the Supreme Court struck down censorship of newspapers, and by 1927, Justice Brandeis was writing that freedom to think as you will and to speak as you think are indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth. But despite increased free speech and torches of liberty and flappers and the Harlem Renaissance, the 1920s was in many ways a reactionary period in American history. For instance, the decade saw the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in a new and improved form, and by improved, I mean much more terrible. Spurred on by the hyper-patriotism that was fostered during World War I, the Klan denounced immigrants and Jews and Catholics as less than 100% American, and by the mid-20s, the Klan claimed more than 3 million members, and it was the largest private organization right here in my home state of Indiana. And with more immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, who were often Catholic and Jewish, white Protestants became more and more concerned about losing their dominant position in the social order. Spoiler alert, it turns out okay for you white Protestants. The first immigration restriction bill was passed in 1921, limiting the number of immigrants from Europe to 357,000. In 1924, a new immigration law dropped that number to 150,000 and established quotas based on national origin. The numbers of immigrants allowed from Southern and Eastern Europe were drastically reduced, and Asians, except for Filipinos, were totally forbidden. The quota for Filipinos was set at 50 per year, although they were still allowed to emigrate to Hawaii because their labor was needed needed there. There were no restrictions, however, on immigration from the Western Hemisphere because California's large-scale farms were dependent upon seasonal laborers from Mexico. These immigration restrictions were also influenced by fear of radical anarchists and pseudoscientific ideas about race. Whites were seen as scientifically superior to people of color, and as President Coolidge himself declared when he signed the 1924 immigration law, America must be kept American. Tell me, Calvin Coolidge, about how American you are. Are you Cherokee, or Cree, or Lakota? The 1920s also saw increased tension between science education in the United States and religious beliefs. The best known example is, of course, the trial of John Scopes in Tennessee in 1925. Scopes was tried for breaking the law against teaching evolution, which he had been encouraged to do by the ACLU as a test case for freedom of speech. Scopes was prosecuted by William Jennings Bryan, whom you will remember as having recently resigned as Secretary of State, and who had become a leader of the fundamentalist movement. And Scopes was defended by Clarence Darrow, that famous defense attorney who contemporary defense attorneys always point to argue that defense attorneys aren't all scum. Scopes and Darrow actually lost the trial, but the case drew national attention and ultimately led to evolution being taught in more American schools. The Scopes trial is often seen as a victory for free thinking and science and modernism, and I suppose it was, but for me it's more a symbol of the contradictions of the 1920s. This is the decade that gave us mass consumer culture and celebrity worship, which are important and very complicated legacies, and it also saw the birth of modern conceptions of civil liberties. It was a period when tolerance became an important value, but at the same time it saw a rise in lynchings. Immigrants were necessary for the economic boom of the 1920s, but at the same time their numbers were restricted as they were seen as a threat to traditional American values. And that raises a question that we're still struggling with today. What are those values? I don't mean that rhetorically. Let me know in comments. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The associate producer is Danica John.
I am not going to show this when what I'm going to do is, oh dear, did not mean to do that. It's really nice, but it's, like I say, 7 minutes long, and
every 10 years the census taker
put the link at the end of the lesson so you can watch it if you want to. Yes? That being said, it's the end of the chapter. Thank you for listening.